The courtroom is supposed to be a place of fairness and equality, where justice is blind and everyone is treated with dignity. But for some, that ideal is nothing more than a distant dream. For Tyrell Wright, a 19-year-old legal prodigy stepping into a courtroom wasn't just about representing his client, it was a chance to prove he belonged in a world that was all too eager to shut the door on him. Tyrell wasn't your average teenager. While his peers were still figuring out their paths, Tyrell had already passed the bar exam, becoming one of the youngest licensed attorneys in the state. It was an achievement born from relentless nights of studying, unwavering discipline, and a determination to rise above the expectations placed on him as a young black man from a low-income neighborhood. But for Tyrell, his success was never about proving others wrong. It was about proving to himself and his family that he could create a better future, not just for them, but for others like him. That morning, as Tyrell walked into the courthouse, the familiar weight of judgment pressed against him. He felt it in the stares, the whispered conversations, and the subtle but unmistakable disbelief etched on people's faces. But Tyrell had learned to carry that weight with pride. He wasn't just representing a family friend in a small claims case. He was standing up for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Before he even reached the courtroom, the signs were clear. A bailiff gave him a once-over and asked for his identification, his tone skeptical. Tyrell complied without hesitation, offering a polite smile as he handed over his attorney's license. The bailiff frowned, clearly surprised, before waving him through. Tyrell had seen this reaction before, the unspoken question. How could someone like you possibly be an attorney? When Tyrell entered the courtroom, he was met with a dismissive glance from the judge, an older man with sharp features and an air of authority. The judge barely acknowledged Tyrell as he took his place at the plaintiff's table, leaning back in his chair with an almost imperceptible smirk. It was the kind of look that said, "You're out of your depth, kid." But Tyrell wasn't there for approval. He was there to do his job, and he approached the task with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through law school. As he opened his briefcase and prepared his notes, he couldn't help but notice the murmurs around him. Courtroom spectators whispering, the opposing counsels sneaking glances at him, and even the judge raising an eyebrow as if silently questioning his presence. Before the hearing even began, the judge addressed Tyrell with a condescending tone. "Are you sure you're in the right place, young man? This isn't a mock trial competition," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Tyrell looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with calm resolve. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "I'm here representing the plaintiff." The judge's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his face before he quickly masked it. "Very well," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's proceed. This should be interesting." The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter, but Tyrell didn't flinch. He wasn't here to entertain anyone. He was here to fight for his client. What he didn't realize was that the judge's dismissive attitude was only the beginning. The next hour would test not only Tyrell's legal knowledge, but his resilience, his composure, and his belief in himself. What Tyrell would soon show the court, however, was that brilliance knows no age, no race, and no limits. And by the time the hearing ended, even the most skeptical in the room would have no choice but to see him for who he truly was. The judge's dismissive tone hung in the air as Tyrell adjusted his papers, refusing to let the derision settle in his heart. He had encountered skepticism before, teachers, peers, even strangers who couldn't fathom that someone like him could excel in a field as demanding as law. But today, the courtroom wasn't just a test of his legal skills. It was a stage where he would have to defend not only his client, but his very right to be there. As the hearing began, Tyrell delivered his opening statement with poise, his voice steady and measured. His client, Mrs. Ramirez, was an older woman who had been taken advantage of by a landlord unwilling to make necessary repairs to her apartment. Tyrrell spoke passionately about the duty of landlords to provide safe, habitable housing and outlined the evidence he would present to prove Mrs. Ramirez's case. But barely a minute into his statement, the judge interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Wright, are you planning to get to the point anytime soon? Or is this going to be a lecture?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Tyrrell felt his pulse quicken. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Your Honor," he replied evenly, "I believe it's important to provide the court with a clear understanding of the facts before proceeding." The judge smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Just make sure you don't waste the court's time, son." Tyrrell pressed on, refusing to let the interruption derail him. He outlined his argument concisely, presenting a timeline of events that demonstrated the landlord's negligence. When he finished, he glanced at Mrs. Ramirez, who offered him a small, encouraging smile. It was a reminder of why he was there, not for the approval of a dismissive judge, but for the justice his client deserved. The opposing counsel, an experienced attorney with decades of courtroom experience, rose for her turn. She glanced at Tyrrell with a smirk before launching into her opening statement, painting Mrs. Ramirez as a tenant who was difficult, demanding, and unreasonable. Her delivery was smooth, confident, and peppered with subtle jabs at Tyrrell's lack of experience. It was clear she viewed him as little more than an inconvenience, a rookie barely worth acknowledging. As the proceedings continued, the judge's bias became more blatant. He allowed the opposing counsel to interrupt Tyrrell repeatedly, questioning his objections and dismissing his points with a wave of his hand. When Tyrrell attempted to cross-examine a witness, the judge cut him off halfway through his first question. "Mr. Wright," the judge said, raising an eyebrow, "I suggest you ask questions that are actually relevant." Tyrrell's jaw tightened, but he nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied. He adjusted his line of questioning, determined to stay on track. But the challenges kept coming. Each time Tyrrell made a point, the judge seemed to find a way to undermine it. He questioned Tyrrell's interpretations of the law, criticized his phrasing, and even made a comment about his age. "Is this your first case, Mr. Wright?" the judge asked during a break in the proceedings, his tone casual but cutting. Tyrrell met his gaze without flinching. "It's my first case in this courtroom, Your Honor," he replied, "but I assure you, I've come prepared." The judge smirked but said nothing, turning his attention to his notes. Tyrrell felt the sting of the judge's words but refused to let them distract him. He had come too far, worked too hard, to let anyone shake his confidence now. As the hearing progressed, Tyrrell began to turn the tide. He presented photographic evidence of the unsafe conditions in Mrs. Ramirez's apartment: leaking pipes, exposed wiring, and mold-infested walls. The photos, taken by a professional inspector, were damning, and even the opposing counsel struggled to discredit them. "This clearly demonstrates a pattern of negligence," Tyrrell said, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "My client repeatedly informed the landlord of these issues, yet no action was taken. This isn't just unacceptable, it's unlawful." The judge glanced at the photos, his smirk faltering for the first time. Tyrrell saw the hesitation and pressed on. He presented a series of emails between Mrs. Ramirez and the landlord, showing her repeated attempts to request repairs and the landlord's dismissive responses. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the case, and Tyrrell's confidence grew with every point he made. But the judge wasn't done testing him. As Tyrrell prepared to call his next witness, the judge leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Mr. Wright, do you even know the rules of evidence? I'd hate to see you embarrass yourself." Tyrrell paused, his grip tightening on his notes. He knew this was a moment that could define the rest of the hearing. If he let the judge's words rattle him, it would show weakness. But if he responded with confidence, it could shift the dynamic in his favor. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Tyrrell said, his voice calm but firm, "I've spent years studying the rules of evidence, and I'm confident in my ability to present my case. If I make a mistake, I trust the court will correct me." The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. The judge stared at Tyrrell for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "Proceed," he said curtly. Tyrrell called his witness, a housing inspector who had examined Mrs. Ramirez's apartment. The inspector's testimony was clear and compelling, confirming the unsafe conditions and the landlord's failure to address them. Tyrrell's questioning was precise, and he handled the opposing counsel's objections with skill and composure. By the time the witness stepped down, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Tyrrell could feel it. The murmurs of doubt were quieter, the judge's smirk less pronounced. For the first time, it seemed as though people were beginning to take him seriously. But Tyrrell knew the battle wasn't over. He still had his closing argument to deliver, and he was determined to make it count. What he didn't know was that the most shocking moment of the day was yet to come, a moment that would change everything. The courtroom was quieter now, the initial laughter and murmurs of dismissal replaced with a palpable tension. Tyrrell had been methodical, presenting evidence and calling witnesses with precision. But the challenges were far from over. The judge, despite being visibly unsettled by some of Tyrrell's arguments, continued his attempts to undermine the young attorney. When the opposing counsel rose to cross-examine the housing inspector, she made a pointed effort to dismiss Tyrrell's work as amateur. "Mr. Wright," she said, glancing at him with a condescending smile, "has this inspector been thoroughly vetted? Or was this just a favor from someone trying to help you build a case?" Tyrrell rose from his seat immediately, his voice steady but firm. "Objection, Your Honor. The inspector's credentials are not in question, and this line of questioning is irrelevant to the case at hand." The judge leaned back, tapping his pen on the bench. "Overruled," he said with a smirk. "Let her finish." Tyrrell clenched his jaw, his heart pounding, but he remained calm. He knew the opposing counsel's strategy was to bait him into making a mistake. He also knew that losing his composure would only play into the narrative the judge seemed determined to create. He took a deep breath and prepared for his next move. As the questioning continued, Tyrrell noticed something. The courtroom was no longer entirely on the judge's side. Spectators, who had initially scoffed at him, were leaning forward, watching him closely. A few even nodded subtly when he spoke, as if rooting for him. Mrs. Ramirez, seated beside him, whispered, "You're doing great, Tyrrell," her voice filled with quiet encouragement. Those words fueled him. He reminded himself why he was here, not to prove the judge or opposing counsel wrong, but to fight for Mrs. Ramirez, who deserved better than the conditions she had endured. Her voice, and the voices of so many others, had gone unheard for too long. Tyrrell was determined to change that. The final witness was the landlord himself, a man in his late 50s who had clearly prepared to dodge responsibility. When Tyrrell began his cross-examination, the landlord smirked, as if daring him to make an impact. "Mr. Carter," Tyrrell began, his voice calm but commanding, "is it true that my client contacted you about the leaking pipes in her kitchen on multiple occasions?" "I wouldn't say multiple," the landlord replied, shrugging. "She mentioned it once or twice, but nothing serious." Tyrrell pulled out a stack of printed emails, holding them up for the courtroom to see. "Then could you explain why we have documented emails from Mrs. Ramirez to you, dated over 6 months, repeatedly requesting repairs?" The landlord's smirk faltered, his expression hardening. "I get a lot of emails. I can't respond to all of them immediately." Tyrrell pressed on, his tone sharpening. "And yet, in your response to Mrs. Ramirez on June 15th, You wrote, and I quote, "Stop complaining and deal with it." Does that sound like a reasonable response to a tenant reporting a health and safety issue? The courtroom was silent. Even the judge, who had been tapping his pen dismissively moments ago, glanced up from his notes. The landlord shifted uncomfortably, stammering, I didn't mean it like that. I was having a bad day." Tyrell didn't let up. "And on your bad day, you dismissed your legal obligation to maintain a habitable residence, leaving my client to endure unsafe conditions for months. Is that correct?" The landlord opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, visibly cornered. The courtroom began to murmur, the shift in energy undeniable. Tyrell had turned the tide, and he wasn't done yet. The judge, however, was not ready to give Tyrell the upper hand. "Mr. Wright," he said, his tone sharp, "do you have any further questions, or are you planning to grandstand?" Tyrell turned to the judge, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, returning to his seat. But the damage had been done, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the hearing moved toward closing arguments, Tyrell prepared himself for the final hurdle. The opposing counsel delivered a polished and aggressive closing, attacking Mrs. Ramirez's credibility and painting her complaints as exaggerated. Tyrell listened carefully, making mental notes, but he didn't flinch. He had the truth on his side, and he knew how to use it. When it was Tyrell's turn, he stood and faced the court with confidence. His voice, steady and measured, filled the room. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, "this case is not just about one tenant and one landlord. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those with power, whether they own property or sit in judgment, are held to the same standards as everyone else. My client, Mrs. Ramirez, asked for nothing more than what she was entitled to: a safe and livable home. And what did she receive in return? Dismissiveness, neglect, disrespect." Tyrell turned toward the judge, his tone unwavering. "Your Honor, this court exists to uphold justice, not appearances. It is my hope that today's decision will reflect that principle." The judge's face was unreadable, but Tyrell could sense the tension in the room. He returned to his seat, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. He had done everything he could, and now all he could do was wait. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, Tyrell noticed the slightest hesitation in his movements. It was as if, for the first time, the weight of his own bias had begun to press on him. What happened next would be the moment that defined Tyrell's journey, not just as an attorney, but as a symbol of perseverance in the face of prejudice. The courtroom was silent as Tyrell returned to his seat, his closing argument still echoing in the air. The judge shuffled his notes, his expression unreadable. Tyrell felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about his credibility, his right to stand in that courtroom, and the respect he'd fought so hard to earn. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, the opposing counsel leaned back in her chair, a confident smirk playing on her lips. Tyrell could feel her condescension without even looking her way. To her, he was still just a kid playing dress-up, a rookie trying to punch above his weight class. But Tyrell didn't care about her opinion. He cared about Mrs. Ramirez, who sat beside him, clutching her purse with trembling hands, her eyes filled with quiet hope. The judge finally looked up, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "I've reviewed the evidence and testimony presented in this case," he began, his tone measured but firm. "And while both sides have made compelling arguments, the law is clear. Landlords have a legal obligation to provide safe and habitable living conditions for their tenants. In this instance, that obligation was not met." Tyrell's heart raced as the judge continued. "Therefore, I rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Ramirez, and order the defendant to pay damages as outlined. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. Mrs. Ramirez gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes. Tyrell felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he kept his composure, offering Mrs. Ramirez a reassuring smile. "We did it," he whispered, and she nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. But the judge wasn't done. He shifted in his chair, his expression tightening as he turned his attention to Tyrell. "Mr. Wright," he said, his voice sharp but quieter than before. "Approach the bench." The room grew tense again, the victory momentarily overshadowed by the judge's sudden request. Tyrell rose, walking toward the bench with measured steps. He stood tall, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet confidence. "Let me see your credentials," the judge said, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism. Tyrell nodded and handed over his attorney's license and bar certification, both neatly folded in his briefcase. The judge unfolded the papers, scanning them carefully. His expression shifted as he read the details, his brow furrowing. "You're a licensed attorney?" the judge said, his voice faltering slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," Tyrell replied, his tone steady. "I passed the bar exam earlier this year and have been practicing law since." The judge looked at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and something that almost resembled guilt. "I see," he said quietly, handing the documents back. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken tension, before the judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Wright, I owe you an apology." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Tyrell blinked, his composure slipping for just a moment. "An apology, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. The judge cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes before speaking. "I underestimated you," he said, his voice low. "I made assumptions about your abilities based on factors that had no bearing on your qualifications. That was wrong, and for that I apologize." Tyrell felt a surge of emotions, relief, vindication, and even a tinge of anger. He had fought so hard to prove himself, and now, standing before the man who had tried to diminish him, he felt the weight of what this moment meant, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. "Thank you, Your Honor," Tyrell said, his voice steady. "I appreciate your words, but I hope this case serves as a reminder that competence isn't determined by appearance or age. It's determined by hard work and preparation." The judge nodded slowly, his expression somber. "You've made your point, Mr. Wright, and I'll take it to heart." As Tyrell returned to his seat, Mrs. Ramirez reached out to touch his arm. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just win this case, you showed them who you are." Tyrell smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "This isn't just for me," he said quietly. "It's for everyone who's been told they don't belong." As the courtroom began to clear, Tyrell gathered his things, his mind racing. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about the ruling. It was about breaking down the barriers that had been built around him from the moment he walked into the courtroom. He had proven that brilliance, dedication, and skill knew no bounds. Not age, not race, not bias. As Tyrell walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit his face, warm and invigorating. Outside, a small group of people had gathered, spectators from the courtroom who had been moved by what they had witnessed. A young black boy, no older than 12, ran up to him, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Wright," the boy said, "you're a lawyer, like a real lawyer." Tyrell crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "That's right," he said, smiling. "And you can be too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The boy beamed, and Tyrell felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the courtroom, it was about inspiring the next generation to believe in themselves, to fight for their dreams, no matter the obstacles. As Tyrell walked to his car, he glanced back at the courthouse, the weight of the day settling in. He had won a case, yes, but more importantly, he had made a statement. And he wasn't done yet. There were more battles to fight, more voices to lift, and more barriers to break. And with every step, Tyrell knew he was paving the way for others to follow. As the courtroom emptied, Tyrell remained seated for a moment, the events of the day washing over him. The victory had been hard fought, but its significance was far greater than the case itself. Mrs. Ramirez had received justice, but Tyrell knew that justice was only one piece of the larger battle he was waging. His journey wasn't just about winning legal battles. It was about challenging a system that had underestimated him and countless others like him. Mrs. Ramirez stood beside him, clutching her purse tightly, as if still processing what had just happened. Her voice broke the silence. "You're a blessing, Tyrell. I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me." Tyrell looked up at her, his eyes filled with warmth. "You deserve this, Mrs. Ramirez," he said softly. "This isn't charity, this is justice, and I'm glad I could help you fight for it." As they stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun, a small crowd had gathered, waiting for Tyrell. The word had spread quickly about the young black attorney who had not only stood his ground against a dismissive judge, but had also won a decisive victory. Spectators who had been in the courtroom lingered, their faces reflecting admiration and curiosity. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Mr. Wright," she called out, her voice carrying over the chatter. "May I have a moment of your time?" Tyrell hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Ramirez, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," she whispered. "People need to hear this." Tyrell turned to face the reporter, standing tall. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the attention. The reporter's eyes sparkled with interest. "Your performance in the courtroom today was remarkable. You've made quite an impression, not just on the judge, but on everyone here. How does it feel to win your first case?" Tyrell took a moment to gather his thoughts. "It feels rewarding," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But this isn't just about me. This case is about holding people accountable, whether they're landlords, employers, or anyone else in a position of power. Justice doesn't come easily, especially for people in communities like mine, and I'm committed to fighting for that justice." The reporter leaned in slightly, sensing the gravity of his words. "You faced a lot of resistance in that courtroom, from the opposing counsel and even the judge. How did you stay so composed under pressure?" Tyrell smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with determination. "I stayed composed because I had to. My client was counting on me, and so were so many others who've been told they don't belong, who've been judged for what they look like instead of what they're capable of. I've spent my life preparing for moments like this, and I knew I couldn't let anyone's bias shake my focus." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few people clapping softly. The reporter nodded, impressed. "What's next for you, Mr. Wright? Do you see today as the beginning of something bigger?" Tyrell's gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on a young boy who had been watching him with wide eyes. The boy's presence reminded Tyrell of why he had chosen this path. "Absolutely," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about one case. It's about building something greater, about creating a legal system that serves everyone, not just a privileged few. Today is just the first step, and I plan to keep walking this path for as long as I'm able." The crowd broke into applause, the sound growing louder as more people joined in. Tyrell felt a surge of energy, a sense of validation that went beyond the courtroom ruling. This wasn't just his victory. It was a shared moment of pride and hope for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or underestimated. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Ramirez gave Tyrell one final hug before heading home. "You've got a bright future, Tyrell," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't let anyone dim your light." Tyrell nodded, watching her walk away with a lighter step than she had entered the courtroom with that morning. Her gratitude, her relief, and her joy were reminders of why he had chosen this path. But as he stood there, Tyrell knew his fight was far from over. Moments like this were rare, and the system he had confronted today wouldn't be changed overnight. There were still judges who would judge him by his age and skin color before they heard a word he had to say. There were still clients who wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to defend themselves. And there were still countless young people like him who were told they didn't belong in spaces of power. That evening, Tyrell sat at his desk, his briefcase still unpacked. He stared at the documents and photos from the case, replaying the day's events in his mind. The judge's condescension, the landlord's evasiveness, the disbelief of the courtroom, all of it had fueled his resolve. He opened his laptop and began drafting a speech. He'd been invited to speak at a local community center the following week, and he knew exactly what he wanted to say. When the day of the event arrived, the room was packed with students, parents, and community leaders. Tyrell stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding as he scanned the crowd. He saw faces that reminded him of his own journey. Young kids with wide eyes, elders with knowing gazes, and peers who were ready to stand beside him in the fight for change. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and steady. "When I walked into that courtroom earlier this week, I knew I was being judged before I even spoke. Not for my abilities, not for my preparation, but for my appearance. And that's a reality many of us face every day. But let me tell you something. The only person who gets to define your worth is you." The crowd erupted into applause, but Tyrell held up a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about one case," he continued. "It's about all of us. It's about making sure that no one, no matter their age, their race, or where they come from, is ever told they don't belong. Because we all belong. And together we can create a world where no one has to prove their humanity. It's recognized from the start." When Tyrell finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into cheers. People rose to their feet, clapping and shouting words of encouragement. Tyrell felt a lump in his throat, but he stood tall, knowing this was only the beginning. Afterward, a young girl approached him, clutching a notebook. "Mr. Wright," she said shyly, "I want to be a lawyer too. Do you think I can?" Tyrell crouched down to her level, smiling warmly. "Not only can you," he said, "but I have no doubt you'll be amazing. Just remember, don't let anyone tell you who you are. You already know." As Tyrell walked out of the community center that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready for it. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. And together, they were unstoppable. As Tyrell left the community center, the cheers and applause still ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. This wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. But as much as the moment filled him with pride, Tyrell knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of a much larger journey. The days following his victory in court were a whirlwind. Tyrell's story began to spread, first through local news and then on social media. The headline said it all. Young black attorney overcomes bias to win landmark case. It was a story that resonated with people from all walks of life, those who had faced similar struggles, those who admired his determination, and even those who had never thought about the barriers someone like Tyrell might face. Emails and messages poured in, many from young people asking for advice or simply thanking him for inspiring them. One message stood out. It was from a high school senior named Darnell, who wrote, "Mr. Wright, I've always dreamed of being a lawyer, but people keep telling me it's not for someone like me. Your story showed me that maybe they're wrong. Thank you for giving me hope." Tyrell read the message twice, his chest tightening. He thought about the weight of representation, the idea that someone seeing you succeed could plant a seed of belief in their own potential. It wasn't something he had thought much about before, but now he realized just how powerful it was. Determined to pay it forward, Tyrell began speaking at schools, community centers, and even virtual events. Each time, he shared not just his courtroom victory, but the struggles that had shaped him. The late nights studying under a dim lamp because his family couldn't afford better lighting. The teachers who doubted him. The moments when he had to summon strength he didn't know he had. At one event, a young girl asked him, "Mr. Wright, weren't you scared when the judge kept putting you down?" Tyrell smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "Of course I was scared. But I learned something important. Fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you keep going, even when it's hard. And every time you push through that fear, you grow stronger. That's how you win. Not just in court, but in life." The crowd applauded, but Tyrell wasn't finished. "And here's the thing," he added, his tone growing more passionate. "It's not just about winning for yourself. It's about opening doors for others, making sure the next person doesn't have to fight as hard as you did. That's how we create real change. Together." His words resonated deeply, and the young girl nodded, her face lighting up with newfound confidence. As Tyrell continued his work, his network of supporters grew. Lawyers, activists, educators, and everyday people reached out, offering their help and encouragement. But it wasn't just about Tyrell anymore. It was about the movement he was building, a community of people committed to justice, equality, and empowerment. One evening, Tyrell sat at his desk, sifting through a pile of thank you letters and emails. Each one told a story, a teacher using his story to inspire her students, a single father telling his kids about Tyrell's perseverance, a young man who decided to apply to law school because of what he had seen. Tyrell realized that his impact extended far beyond the courtroom. It was in every person he touched, every spark of hope he ignited. With that realization came a renewed sense of purpose. Tyrell decided to launch an initiative aimed at mentoring underrepresented youth interested in law. He called it The Right Path, a program designed to provide resources, guidance, and encouragement to young people who might otherwise feel the legal profession was out of reach. The program quickly gained traction. Tyrell held workshops on understanding the law, mock trials to build confidence, and one-on-one mentorship sessions. He made it clear to every participant, "You don't have to look like everyone else in the room to belong. You belong because you've earned it." One day, during a mentorship session, a young man named Malik asked Tyrell, "How do you stay motivated when it feels like the world is against you?" Tyrell paused, looking out the window before answering. "I remind myself who I'm doing this for," he said. "For my mom, who worked 2 jobs so I could have a chance. For people like Mrs. Ramirez, who deserve justice. And for you, Malik, because you're the future. If we let the world's judgment stop us, we'll never get where we're meant to go." Malik nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I won't let it stop me," he said. As Tyrell drove home that evening, he thought about Malik, about Darnell, about all the young people who were stepping forward with courage and hope. He realized that his journey wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about building bridges for those who came after him. Months after his initial courtroom victory, Tyrell was invited back to that same courthouse, not as an attorney, but as a guest speaker for a legal seminar. As he stood at the podium, addressing a room filled with judges, attorneys, and law students, he reflected on how much had changed. "In this very room," he began, I was underestimated, judged, mocked. But I'm standing here today because I refuse to let that define me. And I'm here to tell you that everyone in this room has the power to create change, not just for yourselves, but for the people who will follow in your footsteps. The audience listened intently as Tyrell shared his story, weaving together the struggles, triumphs, and lessons he had learned. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, and several people approached him afterward, thanking him for his words. Later that evening, Tyrell sat down to record a message for his growing online audience. He spoke directly to the camera, his tone personal and heartfelt. "I want to thank every single one of you who has shared this journey with me," he said. "Your support, your stories, and your belief in a better future mean more to me than I can say. This isn't just my story, it's ours. It's about showing the world that no matter who you are or where you come from, you have the power to make a difference." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "And if this story has inspired you, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your dreams. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we're building something bigger than any one person. We're building a community, and that's how real change happens." As Tyrell uploaded the video, he felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he had experienced before. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a mentor, an advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced, and he knew his work was only beginning. In the days that followed, the comments poured in, messages of gratitude, stories of inspiration, and pledges to join Tyrell's mission. People weren't just watching, they were acting, building on his momentum to create ripples of change in their own communities. Tyrell's journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. Every step he took, every barrier he broke, was paving the way for others to rise. And together, they would create a world where justice, equality, and opportunity weren't just ideals, they were realities.